This is James Katigan interviewing today Zona Strong from Geary, Oklahoma on May the 24th, 1973 for the Oklahoma Living Legends in the Oklahoma Christian College. Ms. Strong, this is the most pleasant day to have such an interview. Let's just begin this interview by asking you something of your background and where you were born.
Now I'm starting. Well, I was born in Mercer County, Missouri, 4 miles west of Lineville, Iowa, which was on the state line between Iowa and Missouri. But early in life, my father bought a farm in Iowa, in Decatur County, and we lived there until after, well, a short while. And then I remember while I was young on the farm, there was quite a dispute over the state line between my grandfather, Moore, in Missouri, and a man on the north side, McLaughlin, and a few others. And while the sheriff on the north side, the Iowa surveyor had the county surveyor that had one line between the states, and when they had the Missouri surveyor, my grandfather's surveyor, it was different. It was farther north. I remember an occasion where I was at my grandfather's, and my cousin and I one evening went out to see if our grandmother was returning. She'd been away that day, and grandfather had an axe chopping the fence down of the man on the north side. The man had built this fence so closely to my grandfather's, people were unable to travel the road, and they had to go through the field. Well, the same McLaughlin, the man on the north side, the sheriff was hidden at his place, and as my grandfather was walking down the state line, he supposed in Missouri, the Iowa sheriff rode up behind him, grabbed him, and dragged him through the fence on the north side in Iowa, claiming that he was trespassing. After this other incident, my grandfather couldn't go to Iowa without being arrested for this deed, chopping the fence down. So we lived about a mile from the state line. They brought my grandfather to the house, and we were surrounded by neighbors and everyone, my grandfather's friends. In fact, 2 of his sons said to him, ask him if he wanted to go home. If he did, they'd see that he could go. But he didn't. He was taken to the county seat and charged. He was released and returned home, but one incident, there were men of both sides around our house. One of them said to my uncle, he said he made a face at him as he came in the house. Well, he said, I didn't. I was looking at you just as pretty as I could. Now then. Later, it was surveyed by the state line, and they set posts, cement posts in the ground, Iowa on one side and Missouri on the other. And that was final of the feuding of the state line.
Ms. Strong, tell us what you remember about your coming to Oklahoma, something about your family and how you arrived here, and what part of Oklahoma did you arrive in? Where did you come to in Oklahoma?
My father, shall I tell about how he come to come? My father came to Oklahoma prospecting, looking for a new location. So when he was coming, his brother that had served on the county commissioners with Mr. John D. Strong, he wanted to for Dad to be sure and come and see John Strong, which he did. So he made arrangements with John Strong. That was the summer of the drawing in El Reno for the country across at Hydro. So he wanted us to live there at his place until after the drawing, which we did. But in arriving at Oklahoma, he chartered a car, brought all our household goods, and a team of mules and implements to farm that summer.
Mrs. Strong, tell us about your life on the ranch and the number of years you spent there while you were young.
Well, I spent 20 years there, and sometimes I've regretted it, thinking that from the time I was about 18, and those days, what I had missed, and yet then I thought I had had experiences no one else ever would have. And first I'll recall when we moved to the ranch, my husband bought half interest with his father. Later, he bought all of it. And Mr. Strong, his father, moved to Geary. But my experience, my baby, I had a baby born about 5 months old. I had Fred's father and son Claire, and he had a brother or a hired hand. And I had never been, in fact, hadn't put a meal on a table in my life by myself. So it was something for me to do. Oh, but I was very much a coward living at this place, as I'd always lived with my family. And when the men were gone, I would always keep the doors locked. And the Indians visited us quite a bit. My husband traded with them. And one day they butchered a beef at our place at the corral, and I was there and heard him talking to them about would be going down to their place and getting some posts. So I went on to the house and prepared to go with him. And when he came by the house, drove right by the door, he said, "Why, you can't go. I am bringing back a load of posts." Well, okay. I forget I'm talking. So he went on, and I looked over across the creek at the corral, and I saw a woman. And that was don't happen. It was so unusual. No one ever came to our place on foot. So I took the baby, ran up the canyon after the wagon as hard as I could go, screaming, "Fred, Fred, Fred," every breath. And I overtook him. And he said, "Well, what is the matter?" What could I say? I saw a woman. Well, where was she? Over around the corral, just sneaking around over there. Oh, it was that little Nikolai girl came up after her dog, I suppose. He said, "Well, you get on and go with me." "No, I won't." "Well, what will you do?" "I'll stay here in the timber till you get back." "Well, you can't do that." "Well, I can't go. I left your money and your watch laying in front of the door on a chair." "Well, what are you going to do?" "Well, if you'll go back with me, I'll stay after I look through the house," having heard what it might have been. So he drove back and went down and turned around and back, and I stayed the rest of the evening.
Ms. Strong, how about your children in these early days? Tell us about your children.
My oldest baby that we brought with us when we came to the ranch passed away in 1904. Later, in 1906, a girl, Irene, was born. And 1907, George was born. 1910, Dylan was birth. And 1913, a girl, Ida Catherine. And 1914, a boy, Jim.
How many grandchildren do you have?
I have 8 grandchildren and about 8 great-grandchildren.
Ms. Strong, in these early days, tell us something about your communications, like your postal service or your rural telephones, or did you have telephones during this time out on the ranch?
We had no telephone when we first came there. And in fact, in sickness, when my oldest girl was born, we had to ride horseback. Man went a horseback 4 miles to call the doctor. And again, when George was born, they had to go out in the pasture and run up a saddle horse, and took some time, and then wait for the doctor to drive out 15 miles, team and buggy. Then, later, my husband bought a telephone line with Mr. Smedley. He had a line running to his house about 4 miles east of us and a switchboard and charged the customers on west of him and north 10 cents to talk. But then after he sold the line, Fred bought the half interest in it. They took that line out and ran it straight through to our place. At that time, there were just about 4 on the line. Later, those north built to it, but we never could get central. We call everybody on the line. So the men north of us decided they would build a telephone line around the switchboard because they thought the woman at the house where the switchboard was, they had never removed it, which they were supposed to. So they built around so she couldn't, they said she wanted to eavesdrop, so whenever she was out in the yard, she would turn the switch on until she came back. Well, those fellows were going to do that, then to move, so my husband said, well, they weren't going to leave us on the other side of the line, so he loaded up the telephone poles and had the hired man and was up at daylight next morning ready to go and build another. Well, Mr. Smedley didn't want that. He said it would ruin the looks of his place. A good many commented they didn't know how it could look any worse. And so Smedley, he decided he'd take the switch out, which I guess he did. We never knew, but we never had so much trouble later.
Mrs. Strong, in these days, it'd be interesting to know, and at this time, about your farm equipment, how you till the soil, and your farm machinery during those days.
Well, farming implements wasn't, we had the riding cultivators and corn planters and discs. They weren't very large. Also threshing. One year we stacked the grain, and the man who did it didn't understand. The grain rotted. So the next year, Fred and Mr. Robert L. Brand, they bought a threshing machine, one that was geared with horses, the power, which was, I think we only used that about a couple of years. Now then what?
Do you remember hearing anything about the floods on the South Canadian River in the early days of?
Well, we lived 1.5 miles from the river, and in 1904, I believe, the river came down bluff to bluff. My mother had come over to stay all night with me the night before, and the river was dry. I told her I could take her back to Hydro the next day. And in the night, my little brother, about 4 years old, and he awakened Mother, and we were up, and I said, Mother, you won't go home in the morning. I could hear the river roaring. And that was the time the bridge went out, and the man from Geary, the railroad agent, was in a tree all night. And another boy, one of our neighbors, had grown up in our neighborhood, Leniger, wasn't found. They found his body several days later. And there were others, but I can't recall right now.
Now tell us about your experience with the Logan School.
Well, the first time I was at the schoolhouse, I went to a school meeting, and Joseph Williams and Robert L. Brand, I know, were two of the members. And I had gone, they wanted me, in voting for a director. Well, it was a tie. And Williams was president, so he had the say, and he said, well, in order to favor my friend, Mr. Robert L. Brand, I'll have to vote for Joseph W. Williams. But while they were voting, I didn't need to vote. While they were voting, someone asked, Fred, is your wife old enough to vote? Well, he said her teeth show she was. So later then, the school, later is it all right? My children attended the school. They were too small to walk 2.5 miles. So the first year they went, the hired hand took them on horseback, usually of a morning. And then they rode home with Raleigh Scott in the evening, and then they walked the mile back on to our place. Well, let's see. Oh, when they started the school, the two oldest, I had taught them at home. They had read through the primer, through the first reader, and part way in the second reader. The oldest, Irene, didn't sound her R's, and she would tell everyone, us kids gonna start school 1st October, gonna start in second reader. And the boy was only 4 at the time, but at that time, he was a better student than she. And the teacher, she sent me a note, and she put the kids in the primer. And I wrote her a note and told her they could read good in the second reader. So she sent me a note a few days later and said I was correct. And that was all right. I taught my children at home in the McGuffey's reader. They started just every word repeated itself. And in their lessons in McGuffey's, there was always a moral to the story. In the other books, that not fairy tales as they had in later years. I had one of my mother's old McGuffey readers, and the footnotes would say, do not say winder for window, and other words the same. It's very uncommon for anyone to do that.
Mr. Strong, what are these stories that we hear you know about the Phil Hawk Saloon?
Phil Hawk run a saloon in Geary. And when my husband came to Oklahoma from Iowa, he came with his father's chartered car. He was a young man, about 21, and he had a few $100s in his pocket. And of course, the saloon and all was new to him. He got acquainted there. And Phil Houck, the manager, said that someone had written a letter on his stationery and with his return, but it was addressed to someone else, but it was returned to him. And in that letter, he said they had planned to rob Fred Strong when he came in that night. So he contacted John Strong and told him, he said, that's wrong. He had contacted John Dillon and told him that is for John Strong's boy. And John Dillon said he must put the money in the bank. So he found him and took him to the bank and deposited the money. And then it was safe.
Now, said 2 weeks about the president, what he did, you find out 2 weeks of what he did.
Yeah, that's all.
He mentioned that example. Now, Miss Strong, how many acres or what was the size of your ranch and farm, and what was the livelihood? Was it wheat, corn, cattle?
We had about 13 quarters of deeded land and then several leases of Indian land for pasture and hay. And our principal crop to begin with was corn and some wheat. The corn was fed to the cattle in the feedlot. Every winter we ground feed and fattened cattle for shipping to Kansas City first and then to Oklahoma City. And we had several hogs. We had Hereford cattle and the Black Angus, 2 different breeds. Enough.
Ms. Strong, what is your age at the time? Tell us, if you don't mind, your age and when you were born.
Well, I don't know who'd want to know, but I'll be 89 in October.
We have just had an interview with Miss Zona Strong of Geary, Oklahoma. This interview is made on May the 24th, 1973, from Geary for the Oklahoma Living Legends and the Oklahoma Historical Society. For the Oklahoma Living Legends, this is James Katigan, your interviewer. Zona Strong of Geary, Oklahoma, continued.
I wanted to pay a tribute to Orrin Dillon, what I considered one of the best businessmen that Geary or anyone ever knew. I have never seen anyone that was for the little fellow as well as the big, which he was both. I remember an instance where a man wanted to buy a horse from me when I was in the post office. And when I went to the bank, I said to Orrin, this man wants to buy this horse, but I'm afraid he doesn't have the money. He said, well, I think he can get it. So the next morning, when I raised the window at the post office, there was the man. He just plunked down $50 was the price. Again, and then there was a man that owed me some money. And I was at the bank, and several were waiting to see Orrin when a man said to me, "Go on, you go ahead, Mrs. Strong." And Orrin says, "She wants to see you." So, all right, he and I went to the back. I told him that I wanted the money he owed us. Well, he didn't figure he thought that someone else owed it, but he said it wouldn't be right to take it off of you, and he gave me a check for it. But the point is that he was always knew the little fellow as well as the big man's business, and was willing to always help anyone in need.
This is your interviewer, James Katigan, for the Oklahoma Living Legends from Geary, Oklahoma, on Thursday, May the 24th, 1973.